This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello and welcome today to Politico's Healthcare Summit. I'm Ashley Furlong, a healthcare reporter at Politico. Yesterday we heard from people like the European Medicines Agency's Emma Cook and Ukraine's Health Minister Viktor Lyashko. And we discussed everything from the pharmaceutical strategy to the European health data space. Today you're in for another round of fantastic interviews and panels, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's in the room today. There'll be more of you joining later, and there's many of you online. Before we get going, I'd like to say a big thank you to our partners for making this summit possible. To the leading partners, Janssen, FPA and Pfizer, the presenting partners, Bayer and Teva, and the networking partner, Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. You can ask questions only through the swap card platform. The instructions you can find on the event website. If you're already on the platform, you can chat with other attendees and ask questions in the question box on the right of the screen if you're on the desktop, and and below the live stream if you're on your mobile. And if you're in person, there should be on your chairs, there should be a little flyer that will explain how you can log in. And please also do tweet today using the hashtag Politico Healthcare. I'm now going to turn to our first interview with the World Health Organization's envoy to the ACT Accelerator, Ayoade Alakija. Welcome, Ayoade.
Thank you very much, Ashley. It's very nice to be with you.
We're at the stage in the pandemic when everyone is sort of shifting their thoughts to the next inevitable health crisis and assessing what went wrong during COVID-19. And one of the major failures that has been identified is the inequity and the nationalism that we saw, where countries sought to protect their own populations rather than help their neighbors. And a lot of the focus in the EU is on ensuring our systems are ready for the next crisis to not repeat those mistakes. And I'm wondering, sort of as an opening thought, if you thought the EU is doing enough to ensure that the rest of the world is as prepared as the bloc is for the next inevitable health crisis.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. I would say that nobody in the world is doing enough. It's now over 2 years since President Macron proposed the Charter for Equitable Access to COVID Tools during the Paris Forum, which subsequently led to the formation and the establishment of the ACT Accelerator. The EU put $7 billion behind that. And as you said in your opening gambit, the attention is beginning to shift, but quite wrongly so, because as we see the emergence of new variants or subvariants at the moment, as we begin to see peaks in various parts of the world. I've just recently been in India, where they're sequencing and looking at, subvariants coming out of Kolkata, subvariants coming out of Singapore. That at the moment, we don't know what we're going to do. So is the world as a whole doing enough? Not just is the EU doing enough. Of course, I know that this is an EU meeting, but I would say that we all need to do more. We heard at the World Health Summit from Sandra Galina at the Ports to Arms session, where she reiterated the EU's commitment and support towards not just ending the acute phase of this pandemic, but also towards ensuring that there is a future countermeasures platform that is supported and that is equitably governed and that includes the voices of all of us. So for me, the narrative of are we preparing well for next time, I don't think we can go there yet because we're not yet done with this time.
And you sort of said how there's waning attention on the pandemic, and it's also we're seeing sort of waning interest in vaccines and people getting their boosters. And one of the sort of outcomes of that is that we've seen that likely vaccine prices might increase. And we saw very recently Pfizer saying they want to quite dramatically increase the prices of their COVID vaccines in the US. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that decision.
Look, I'm quite conscious. I know that Pfizer is one of the sponsors of this summit, and I have to say that that is an outrageous, to me, decision and announcement in view of the billions that have been made already. I mean, that to me is venturing into the realms of pandemic profiteering, but that is not the reason for this meeting. I think enabling equitable access needs to start from the beginning of the research and development process through to manufacturing, licensing and distribution and delivery of these medical countermeasures. And it's not just vaccines, actually. It is also diagnostics and now therapeutics, of which we don't have therapeutics yet on the African continent. You introduced me as the special envoy for the ACT Accelerator, but my most relevant hat in all of this is as chair of the Africa Union Africa Vaccine Delivery Alliance, which we're actually now beginning to we're sort of shape-shifting into the Africa Countermeasures and Readiness Alliance, because of course it's not just the conversation was all about vaccines at the very beginning, and to some extent it distracted us. It distracted the world from what else is going on. It distracted the world from the fact that the very metric by which we measure the impact of this pandemic, which is, the ICU beds and how full they were and what pressure there were on systems, was in itself inequitable, because it neglected to note that in countries where there were no diagnostics, where a test, for someone like me who was able to get a test would cost $100. So even for those of us who could access a test, it was painful, and therefore you didn't necessarily go and test, and so we don't know what the outcome was. So that in itself was inequitable. It's not just the vaccines. Paxlovid, the one therapeutic that we know has enough sort of sufficient efficacy, although now as the variants in itself, I've always said, Ashley, that this was a race between various virus variants and vaccine. And the virus has beaten us. And now we're going into a point where people are talking about living with COVID. But what does that look like? Long COVID is nasty. And what we're doing is substantially reducing the economic activity of young populations, because initially it was like, oh, well, we were almost going into a necropolitics realm there for a moment, where people were beginning to say, well, if the weak and the infirm die, maybe that's not such a bad thing. The way the world has handled this pandemic has been outrageous from not just from an equity perspective, but from an ethics perspective. Our ethics have been warped, and the fact that people are now talking about charging $100 and something for a vaccine that billions have been made of is wrong. And I think we must be brave enough to say so, to say that it is wrong, to say that there has to be a public good. One is not preaching pure socialism. One is talking about the value of life, that a value of life in New Delhi be equal to the value of life in New York, that a value of a life in Accra be equal to a value of a life in Amsterdam. That is not what the world is telling us at the moment. And we must stand up very strongly against this, because like COVID, like climate, those two are two sides of the same coin. But we're not yet done with COVID, and yet, I'm hearing in different parts of the world. I'm in Asia at the moment, but I'm hearing in Europe it's 21 degrees almost in November. The world is in crisis, and pharmaceutical industries, the big industries need to recognize that they need to play a part in ensuring that people live, so that they have people they can sell there and market their products to. We are in a difficult moment in history, with conflict, climate, and crisis all, this confluence of issues at the same time.
Thanks, Ayoade. I wanted to sort of touch on your other hat, as you mentioned, you working on sort of vaccines capacity in Africa. And we've seen a lot of talk about African manufacturing capacity and the need to sort of improve this. There's been a lot of investment from the EU, pretty substantial investment, and we'll hear a bit about that later. But, there's also been, we've seen some of the discussion has then sort of led to some sort of failures on the ground. For example, Aspen in South Africa was meant to produce its own version of the J&J vaccine, and then they never got any orders. So, there's a bit of, between the ambition and then, the actual outcome, there's sometimes a bit of a lag. And I'm wondering how we address that issue.
Yeah, well, again, fascinatingly, I've just been at the Developing Countries Manufacturing Annual General Meeting, where it was really heartening to see the whole world, developing countries, that is, not just Africa, big contingent from Africa, including Aspen that you've mentioned, and I wouldn't call that a failure, but I'll get to that in a moment. Latin America, there in force, Brazil, various other countries from Latin America, of course, India, that is doing incredible work in this regard. Look, one of the things the pandemic did was it shocked us all into some sort of action, right? It shocked us into we need to be self-sufficient. And the reactionary nature of that, I think, is what we need to prevent for the future. We need to be in this dynamic state of readiness. So the Aspen situation where there were no orders, but there were no orders because the world suddenly woke up to, oh my goodness, Omicron and other variants are coming out because we have not vaccinated the world, and therefore started to donate huge quantities of vaccines bilaterally. Now, what has happened in this pandemic has been as much geopolitical as it has been health. It's been a geopolitical crisis. I've said this before. It's been a socioeconomic crisis. It's been an education crisis. It's been a crisis for women and girls, a gender crisis, and that, to my mind, was what delayed the Aspen process. But I don't call it a failure because Aspen has now subsequently gone on to sign deals and agreements with Serum Institute of India, for instance, to produce 5 vaccines, which are regular sort of childhood immunization vaccines. So what is happening out of this? There is an opportunity coming out of this crisis for vaccine manufacturing, sort of diversified and regional vaccine manufacturing. It cannot just be about COVID vaccines. The EU have done an incredible job in supporting, I think, Senegal, Rwanda, which is more aspirational because they don't have current vaccine manufacturing capacity. But Senegal have been manufacturing vaccines since 1937. They have the WHO pre-qualification. They manufacture most of the vaccines that currently are in use in Africa, yellow fever, and also are manufacturing diagnostics. So I don't actually want us to focus just on vaccines. Again, let us not be distracted because we need diagnostics, we need therapeutics as well. And we need to be sure that countries and regions are self-sufficient as much as possible because the nationalism, but yes, and the populism, the wave of which we're seeing in the world at the moment, has shown us that, when it comes to do or die, regions need to be able to look after themselves.
And on that regional aspect, there's been a lot of discussion about how we procure vaccines, therapeutics for the next health crisis. And we've seen, a pretty effective regional procurement in the EU. There might have been some criticism at the beginning, but, many millions of vaccines were procured and delivered to citizens. And I'm wondering if you think those sorts of regional mechanisms might be a better way to go in the next crisis rather than a mechanism like COVAX, which attempted to be global but didn't really have the global buy-in.
That is a complex question. I think the regional mechanisms for sure, but I mean, you're talking about regional mechanism for mainly high-income countries in Europe, that sort of bloc that supported itself. I mean, I, in fact, at the World Health Summit, together with Anders Nordstrom, hosted a breakfast on a side meeting and convened on regionalism, talking about this exact thing. And it was really fascinating to see how regions are dealing with this. And Martin, who you will have in the panel later on, was part of that meeting, so perhaps we'll speak to a little bit of that. I think regionalism is definitely, we have to build stronger regions. I think we also need to build stronger South-to-South cooperation as a whole. Was COVAX, and the other thing is, I don't like to refer to COVAX as COVAX because I think that's part of what the problem was, an over-branding of a pillar of the ACT Accelerator. It was a vaccine pillar of the ACT Accelerator, and it almost seemed to sort of develop this life of its own, which is why there was undue focus, to my mind, on the vaccine side of things. But COVAX has delivered 1-point-something billion vaccines, but COVAX was late. COVAX was late because high-income countries the greed, really, of high-income countries countries and the lack of global solidarity. We learned that global solidarity does not exist. We learned, as Peter Piot and my brother John Nkegasong recently said at the Virchow Prize presentation, that global health was not truly global. And so what the world was telling those of us from low and low middle income countries, those of us who were dying for want of a breath, what the world was telling us was that your lives do not matter. And therefore we have to, as those blocks, we have to come together as South to South cooperation and ensure that this does not happen again. I think multilateralism is desperately needed, but the way the multilateral global structures have been created, I often, thought a lot about this through the pandemic and realized that they were created post-World War II to rebuild Europe. They were rebuilt in the image of Europe for Europe and America. They looked like and were shaped for a certain block of people. And that is not wrong, because there was a situation there at the time. But now things have changed and we must reimagine that. And does that reimagining mean we no longer are global? No, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to work together. We have to act together as a global community, because together we sink. If we don't hold on together, it's like otters, when they're swimming and they sleep, they hold on to each other's hands so that they don't sink. We have to be like otters as global community. Africa, Europe, Latin America, Asia, we all need to be like otters. Isn't that a cute image? We all need to be like otters holding on so that we don't sink. And so that we can rest, because that's what they do when they need to rest. They're able to rely on another. So we can't give up the global picture, but we must strengthen our regions. We must strengthen our regional production, our regional procurement. Let me use another example from my other home, which is in the Fiji Islands in the Western Pacific. The islands of Fiji and many of those other islands would have perished. Their populations would have, at one point, the death per capita in Fiji was higher than India. It was higher. They were the worst hit in the world. But then Australia, because they had regional production, Australia was able to ship them little bits and pieces of vaccines as they had them. And therefore, they were now able to get up to, I think it's 90-something% of people vaccinated, including young people and teenagers. And that economy is now one of the fastest growing in the world. It is not rocket science. If we vaccinate, if we provide the countermeasures, the economies will grow. So those who are in the capitalist world, who say some of us are socialists, we're not socialists. We're just humanists. We just have some ethics that are different from yours. And we're saying that the world's economy will grow if you provide basic universal healthcare. So now this goes beyond COVID and goes into what you were saying about the next pandemic, which is not too far away, sadly, from the signs that we're seeing.
Thanks, Ayoade. I just want to remind everyone that they can ask questions on the Swapcard app, and I will ask them if you pop them in there. I want to sort of get onto something a little bit more nitty-gritty about the R&D and investment in R&D. And we saw during the pandemic, there was a lot of, obviously, government investment in R&D, but often, this was done maybe before the pandemic in different vaccine platforms, for example, and often there wasn't sort of access provisions built into this investment. And we have this with CEPI, where there are access provisions built in when when CEPI funds certain products. But I'm wondering if you think that there needs to be more of a shift of how we invest in R&D to ensure that the products that come out of it are able to be equitably distributed in a health crisis.
Absolutely, I don't consider that nitty-gritty at all. I think those are the basics. I think that from the very get-go, and I think that was one of the first things I said. First things I said is that from the R&D perspective, we need to be talking equity and access. We cannot, we cannot do testing and trials on populations that we are now. First of all, let's even talk about the fact that some of the countermeasures that we had, not just vaccines or medicines, but even the oximeter, the simple oximeter, did not pick up the right oxygen for Black and brown people because it was being tested for Caucasian skin. So R&D, not just on vaccines or medicines, but across the scale. If you look at R&D and the ethics of R&D testing for driverless cars that run over Black and brown people because they didn't consider Black and brown people when they were making driverless cars. We have to have a more equitable viewpoint for R&D. We have to have a more ethical viewpoint for R&D around the world. It is not just around vaccines. It is not just around medicines. If people are dying because they are putting their finger on an oximeter, which you're being told if it is below 90, go to a hospital, but because you're brown or Black, it's telling you it's not reading properly. It's telling you that you're at 98%. How many people in poorer communities, not just in Africa, not just in Asia, but in Europe itself or in America, how many poor Black, brown people died because they were unable to measure properly their oxygen saturation because the R&D that was done for oximeters is inequitable in itself. This system is broken. Ashley, this system is broken, and this pandemic has put a bright magnifying glass on it, and we must keep speaking. We cannot lose the opportunity within this crisis to change the system for generations to come. It might not fully change for us in this current generation, but it is our job and our responsibility to make sure that driverless cars do not run down our children in the future because nobody considered that Black and brown people walk the road, or that oximeters and other medical countermeasures do not take into account the melanin in our skin. I mean, I spoke on bioethics yesterday and talked about Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were heroically used, but she was exploited because she was poor, she was female, and she was Black.
I want to sort of move to a discussion that's happening in Geneva at the moment on the pandemic treaty, and there's a lot of debate around what should be included, what shouldn't be included in it, and obviously the EU was the initiator of the idea of a pandemic treaty, and there's also even discussion if we need a treaty, but maybe we don't go into that now. But I was wondering if you had sort of top 2 or 3 things that you thought that needed to definitely be in the treaty and what those would look like.
I think we definitely need a pandemic treaty. I'm very much in favor of a pandemic treaty. I think my experience of working through this pandemic, initially from the Africa perspective and now from both the Africa and the global perspective, and increasingly, with India, increasingly with Latin American colleagues, is showing me that there are many, our voice as Africa was the loudest because we were the most left behind, but there are many regions that felt left behind. So therefore, it must be inclusive. It must be inclusive of voices from regions. It must be inclusive of voices from all communities, not just civil society as traditional civil society, those who are embedded within organizations, but it must be a broad-based governance model. A pandemic treaty also has to have some leadership aspects to it. I know that those who are speaking about a Global Threats Council, but for me, I would say that, yes, we need a Global Threats Council. We need this to be elevated to heads of state level, because that is how we in Africa were able to initially get to the head of this, because President Ramaphosa, in his leadership at the time as chairperson of Africa Union during that initial year, was able to set up the 3 pillars of Africa's response. So it went to a heads of state response. And that is what we need. We need heads of state to be able to speak to the gravity of the situation. But anybody who's worked with heads of state also knows that that's a heavy lift, and that is not a practical day-to-day solution. So whilst we need heads of state to be involved, we also need the practicality and the technical people on the ground. But a pandemic accord cannot just be medical. A pandemic accord has to be or health focused. We have to look at a One Health approach. We have to look at the broader spectrum of what we're dealing with in the world at the moment. And what COVID has taught us, which I have believed for a long time, is that global health is geopolitics. Global health is political. Right now, we're going into the India G20 presidency, and a lot of the conversation, I have been in India for a few days, and a lot of the conversation is around health and about how we prevent what has just happened to us. There's a lot of hurt in the the world. There's a lot of trust that has been broken between different regions. And a pandemic accord has to come together in a way that builds that trust. That again, going back to me and my otters, that for me is the model that builds that trust between the various regions and the various peoples of the world. We need attention to preparedness. Or what I call a dynamic state of readiness. We cannot wait until it is upon us before we begin to address it. But, actually, we are not out of this current pandemic. And as XB1 is beginning to spike around the world, and I was listening to Scrabble, somebody referring the other day to Scrabble variants and all sorts of horrendous named things, we have to remember that until we get countermeasures, whilst people are getting bivalent and polyvalent soon doses in America and in Europe, there are those in Africa and Latin America and Asia, parts of Asia that are yet to be vaccinated. The effects of long COVID, we are not talking about. What is that going to do to a population that is 70% under the age of 30 when they are unable to be economically viable perhaps in 5 to 10 years' time? We did not learn the lessons of HIV/AIDS because it wasn't until about 5-10 years that we understand truly what the HIV virus could do to the body. And we are beginning to learn that now, but we're learning it too late, and this sense of complacency concerns me. So a pandemic treaty should be discussed, but a pandemic treaty must focus also on the urgency of the here and the urgency of the now.
You mentioned, the treaty needs to go beyond just health. And speaking to diplomats in Geneva, it seems like that's actually quite a difficult question because, we talk about competency a lot in the EU and on health. And, there's questions of whether the sort of is deforestation, something that is under the WHO mandate. Should we be including these sorts of things in the treaty? And there's difficult conversations being had around, whether the WHO is the right place to include all this. And I'm wondering if you think what you think of that, given your role as WHO envoy, obviously for the ACT Accelerator. But I'm sure you have some insights there.
Well, I'm able to be objective. First of all, I don't work for WHO. They don't pay me to be an envoy. So it's it's very much an envoy role. And therefore, one has certain levels of independence. I mentioned earlier One Health. And One Health is One Health, which includes planetary health. It includes animal health. And I think sort of quibbling, and these are some of the challenges I have with some of the different bits of our multilateral system, quibbling who should be in charge of what. Something that I believe it was Mike Ryan said the other day, which just resonated so much with me, is that we need to leave our egos at the door. This is not about who's going to be in charge of what. The definition of health, the sort of in the WHO Constitution, is a complete state of social, emotional, physical well-being and an absence of disease and infirmity. That One Health umbrella covers the earth. It covers deforestation. It covers animal health. It covers the whole gamut. So I don't think that, the nitpicking, this is what, these are some of the reasons why I guess I don't work in some of these institutions, because the endless conversations and the endless arguments, we need to get to the practicalities of the matter. Should it sit in WHO? Yes, it should sit in WHO, because it is WHO that declares when there's a pandemic. That, I think, is that's just a non sequitur. Let's not argue about the irrelevancies. Let's argue about the specifics of what we're going to do. Let's argue about the practicalities of what this pandemic accord will include. When we look at climate at the moment, when we look at, we look at the floods in Nigeria, my own home country that is being taken over, 36 states taken over by flood, millions of people displaced. We look at the floods in Pakistan. We look at the weather patterns around the world. Infectious diseases are on the rise. You can't pull these things off in different directions. We did this with AIDS. Again, one of my earliest work was in HIV/AIDS. And I remember at the time I was the first chair of the theme group for AIDS in the Pacific region. I remember very clearly walking into that first meeting, young thing that I was with in my short skirts in those days. And some man who worked at, I think it was WHO, I was with UNICEF, said to me, well, this is a health issue and you who don't understand medicine should not be part of this theme group. And he had no idea that I was a medical doctor. And I said, well, actually, I'm a medical doctor and I do understand medicine, but I disagree that this is purely a medical issue. And there is how UNAIDS was formed. We can't go there. We can't go and create a new pandemic organization because various people's egos are invested in being in charge. We have to be the adults in the room and we have to recognize that we're in a global crisis situation. We don't have time to create new organizations. We can't allow what happened with AIDS to happen with pandemics. Let us deal with it. Let us reimagine the existing structures and let us deal with it with the urgency and the seriousness and the inclusivity that it deserves.
We have just a couple more minutes left. We have a question, and any other last questions, please include them. It's a bit broader, the question. It's about, the person says it's important to increase the focus on generic drugs as one of the pillars that support healthcare in a troubled global economy. And they are saying that instead there seems to be more focus in international fora to pay more for brand name drugs. And I'm sure that we might have some generics industry people online, and I'm wondering if you think that is that something that you're also concerned about?
Well, I don't disagree with that question at all. I mean, I think that because it's about affordability and it's about access. And, I think one of the things that we saw in this pandemic, even around the vaccines, that was bizarre to those of us who are in this space is that people suddenly started naming which vaccine they wanted. I mean, when did anybody ever know who created a flu vaccine? I don't know who made the flu vaccine I had 4 years ago or 5 years ago. And I think we have gone there because of this branding that has come along. And it was geopolitics. It started off with the AstraZeneca arguments, and then it went to the BioNTech. It was this region is making this vaccine, therefore this is the premier vaccine. I mean, as I said, I've just recently spent some time in India talking to various manufacturers of medical countermeasures, not just vaccines. And it is interesting to see how the price, how accessible things are, because you walk into a store, you don't ask to buy a Panadol, you just ask to buy a paracetamol based drug, and you get given it as it's mind-blowing how accessible it is. But that also goes to the fact that they have a local manufacturing industry. So I agree with that individual. I think we do need to get to a more generic and move away from this naming of sort of brand named be it drugs in any sphere.
We have a question from the audience, but we don't have a roving mic, so could you type it in the app? Yes, please. Thank you. I'm just sort of to round us off, we only have a couple minutes left. I'm wondering, I've been asking people lately, whether they are optimistic now that we are looking at, there's, many more projects working on pandemic preparedness. There's much more acknowledgements of, what went wrong during the crisis and what we need to change for the future. And I'm wondering, how optimistic are you that that the world is going to be better prepared if another COVID 2.0 happened next year?
I don't know, actually. As I said, we're not there yet, and I think there's a lot of talk, but how much of it is action? There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of people trying to bifurcate and bite off pieces. We need to focus on the basics of, as you started to say at the beginning. I mean, the ACT Accelerator was set up, and again, with a very generous contribution of $7 billion from the EU. It continues its work. Its two goals were, number one was product development, which there was an A+. In terms of product development, research and development, the CEPIs, the FINES of this world did an incredible job in getting us diagnostics, in getting us vaccines, and then the COVAX sort of family and trying to deliver them. That's when there was a little bit of a hiccup. So on equitable access, we got a D. And those were the two main objectives of the ACT Accelerator. So we're not there yet. And So if we can't get equitable access, if we're only vaccinating so far, one of the things that was most concerning was the fact that people were constantly saying, we don't think the developing countries can vaccinate up to 70% of their people, so we're just going to give up. Because it was about the value being placed on those lives. And if we don't shift that paradigm, we don't shift that mindset, then I don't have hope that in the next iteration of this, or even if it's a major climate crisis, that we will be able to shift that paradigm. So I think what is needed is a paradigm shift. What I think is needed is a leadership shift, really, a global leadership shift in who decides who lives or who dies, who decides who sinks or who swims. Because for too long, those decisions have been made for us from the outside. Those decisions have been made not with malice, but just with a lack of understanding of what our concerns are in these various parts of the world. Today it's India, tomorrow for me it'll be Lagos in Nigeria or Latin America and Brazil, whose colleagues I was speaking to the other day and who said with passion that they didn't have the voice that we had as Africa during the pandemic, but that they piggybacked onto our messaging because they felt exactly the same. So I can't say that I have hope right now because that paradigm shift still hasn't happened, but we hope we will be getting there.
Thank you so much. And on that note, we're going to have to end the session, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us this morning. We're going to be talking more about these issues in just a moment as we look at whether the EU is living up to its ambitions on global health. Please stay seated as we bring the next panelists onto the stage, and thank you again, Ayoade. Thank you.